To start, I'm Brian Grossman, editor-in-chief of the Colorado Springs Independent, the Colorado Springs Business Journal, and our military newspaper group. And
I am Amy Gillentine. I am the publisher and executive editor of the newspaper group here.
Great, nice to meet you both.
So Ryan, we'll ask you to do the same thing. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. So my name is Ryan Lucas. I've lived in Colorado Springs for the last 3 years. I've lived in Colorado for 14 years. I moved here in 2008. Moved to Colorado Springs because my wife lived down here in Colorado Springs. She's lived here in the state as long as I have. We met up in Denver at a fundraising event that she was actually the organizer for. So met, immediately fell in love, got married about 2 years later, and I moved down here. So she has 2 kids who have been in the D11 school district. So I'm up near Dublin and Powers, that part of Colorado Springs. So she had already established, kind of her family in the area, and so it made more sense for me to move down here than for them to move up to Denver. So I came down here, and in the 3 years that I've been here so far, I've really enjoyed getting to know the people and the neighborhoods, the enclaves of Colorado Springs, and I'm excited about this opportunity to get to know even more people in County Commission District 1.
Okay. Where did you move to Colorado from?
I was actually in Chicago before I moved out to Colorado. I went to school in Chicago, kind of from a lot of different places. So I was born in New York. I lived in Arkansas for most of my teenage years, went to college in Chicago. When I graduated, I moved into downtown Chicago. Not quite really downtown, like downtown Chicago, people would not call it downtown, but for anybody outside of Chicago, it was in the city. Moved to Chicago, and I started working in politics. So I actually was on the media side for a really long time. So I started off with helping with creating rich media content, as rich media campaigns really started to take off. So if you think about, in 2006 into 2008, this is when, Barack Obama's, massive online campaign organizing was going on. There were a lot of different organizations that were, on that sort of uprise and online organizing. So I helped with everything from helping to pass the Farm Bill through digital media campaign organizing strategies and media, all the way to writing content for the HRC. Worked in a lot of different campaigns, and then moved into organizing myself. So I started working in campaigns, field management. Moved out to Colorado because my skill set was interesting for the public interest research group. So if you think of like Nader's Raiders and kind of the continual evolution of that sort of movement, I started moving into helping to find and train the next generation of campaign managers all over the country.
Okay.
So came out to be the executive director of a company, a nonprofit based in Denver, and then ended up running a state rep race out in Lakewood. And then that was kind of the end of my political career for about 10 years. I moved into working in behavioral health. So I worked for a behavioral health care company based in Littleton for about 11 years, and worked my way up from the mailroom to the chief information officer position. So I got a really good, on the ground education in business over those 10 years before moving down to Colorado Springs and moving into IT consulting. So that's what I do for a living now.
Okay. So it sounds like you have behind the scenes political background. What sort of experience do you have that is relevant to the seat that you're seeking? whereas you're usually behind the scenes and you would be in front of the scenes, so to speak. So how does that look?
Yeah, there's a I think there's a very fine line between what's behind the scenes and what's in front of the scenes. I
Mhm.
think if you and it was one of the things that I really loved about being involved in the political process, right? So not the the legislative process, right, or the actual politicking in the position, right? But the process is ultimately very similar, right? It's about engaging people in the issues that matter to them and helping to bring those issues into some kind of realistic fruition, right? Taking into account, disparate opinions and making those things into a reality. And I, look back to my time working in the business world, which is actually not very dissimilar from political organizing in some ways, because there are a lot of different ideas about the way that you should conduct your business or conduct yourself politically, in terms of trying to bring together all of those disparate thoughts and dealing with limited resources and trying to help come up with the solutions that are actually going to help to push an organization forward, whether that's a business or a political district or anything like that. It all comes down to really listening, coming up with solutions that are actually going to work, and then actually doing the work to get them done. And I think that's where a lot of the slippage in government really comes down to. Is I think a lot of people say, we can all agree on these issues, and we're never going to agree on these issues, but we let that polarization stop us from actually getting some work done. That to me, I think is one of the places where I'm very hopeful that as the future county commissioner of District 1, I can help to bridge that gap, especially in a district that, across El Paso County, 40% voted for Biden in the last election. And let's not kid ourselves, that's an unusual number, right? It was fueled by unusual circumstances as what was happening at the top of the ballot. But with 40% of the county voting for Biden, and yet not a single Democrat has ever been representative on the Board of County Commissioners in some 50 years, to me is just such a huge disconnect. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to run for the seat.
You brought up, some interesting statistics, and they're all true. So why do you think this is the right time for you, I guess, and your politics? Why is this the right time for county commission?
Yeah, now, do I know that this is the right time? I don't. I think that there is certainly some shifts that are occurring in this county. It's a county that's growing very, very fast. I mean, 17% over the last 10 years, right? I mean, it's a very fast growing county. We know that the demographics are shifting in this county. We know that political or partisan participation is on the decline, right? More people are dropping out of the two major parties, out of the Democrats and Republicans, and becoming unaffiliated. A lot of that has to do with partisan gridlock and frustration. And I'll tell you that I think one of the things that is different about me, and one of the reasons why I think that I could be a very good commissioner, especially for this district, is I am actually somebody who can sit down and talk with Republicans for hours, and to have done it. When a lot of people probably don't know about this, know this about me, because I never actually made it out of the primary, but I actually ran for Congress in the last cycle. So I ran for CD5, and I came in number 2 for the Democrats, not enough to make it out of the caucus, right? I think I came in like 18% for the Democrats. One of the things that prompted me to run for that seat was the fact that I come from a very conservative background. I mean, my family is, as I mentioned, my family mostly lives in Arkansas. We're actually originally from Buffalo, New York, but most of my family moved from Buffalo down to Arkansas over a couple of decades. a very conservative family. And I grew up sitting around Thanksgiving table having really difficult conversations, because even though I wouldn't have identified as a Democrat when I was a teenager, I certainly had some views that probably lent themselves that direction, but I wouldn't have considered myself a Democrat at the time. And I found that those conversations, were entirely possible if you were actually open to, the viewpoints that inform, the decisions that, individuals, that inform the decisions and beliefs that individuals hold. One of the things that was one of my favorite events that I held when I was running in that process for CD5, I actually held an event out at a bar in Hartselle, because CD5 used to be much larger than it is now, right? So geographically, so it actually used to reach far out to the west out of El Paso County. So I held an event at a bar in Hartselle. And I was told that I was crazy for doing that because it's a community that's very conservative. There's no way that a Democrat would ever survive an event at a bar in Hartselle. But I was on my way out in that direction. I was collecting petitions because at the time, this was just before COVID. So I was still trying to collect petitions to get on the ballot. I wasn't planning on going through the caucus process. As somebody who had done field before, I was like, I want to go meet voters. I don't want to do this in the caucus process, which is kind of insular. Right. I want to do this where everybody's kind of engaged and involved. So I was out collecting petitions and I was out that direction anyway. So I was like, I'm going to hold an event. The event was attended by mostly Republicans. It was actually a great event. We had a blast. I had really great conversations with the members of the community. Actually, the only two people I could not agree with were the two Democrats that showed up at the event, and a lot of that came down to their frustration with progress not being fast enough for them. They wanted things to be like Whole Foods next door to them today, and that's just not the type of community that they were living in. But it was a really great event, and a lot of that again comes down to that sort of empathetic and actually caring, listening to problems and coming up with solutions that actually help to improve things for voters without railroading them into the solutions that are preordained by a particular party.
So very specifically, what are the challenges facing District 1?
So I think transportation and water are the things you're going to always hear about, right? I think, it's concerning for me coming from a place like Denver. When I first moved down here, one of the first decisions that I had to make was I had to buy a car. That was really frustrating for me because I've lived in two other cities where I was able to entirely survive without having to have had to purchase a vehicle. Not against cars. Cars are fine. I wouldn't trade my car at this point. Certainly not in the community that I live in. But what's true is that there's such a disconnect in the communities in El Paso County and Colorado Springs that requires a car in order to move around. And I think as we look at the projections in growth, transportation is going to be critically important to connect these communities. And I think if you were to ask, up into like the Black Forest community, for example, you're going to hear that development is a really big concern. And it's not just limited to that area. I mean, that's a major concern throughout Colorado Springs, and it hits on both sides of the aisle, right? So it's questions about responsible development that is considerate of the communities that have already been here, but it's also development that is considerate of the communities that are coming here, right? So we have to look at how we can balance that development in such a way that we're allowing for those communities that have lived here and have been thriving and successful to maintain their quality of life as they want to see that continue on, but also realize that as more jobs come into Colorado Springs, as more companies come here, as we have this continuing population boom, that we're making sure that we actually have affordable housing for those individuals so that they can become the people who end up taking over those communities later on, right? Because one of the things that is true is that there is going to be shifts in population over time. So in order to responsibly develop, you have to plan for that kind of continual shift, right? As generations change.
So my next question was going to be, how do you assess the relationship between the current board and their constituents? But let me be a little more specific, because your website says you're running to sort of unseat the entire county commission. We were talking beforehand, we're guessing that's symbolic, but
Yes,
what do you mean by that? And I assume that means that you don't think the relationship is very strong between constituents and the board right now.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily such that it's about the current commissioners and citizens.
Okay.
I have a real concern about, again, this goes back to that 40% voting for Biden and the fact that a Democrat hasn't been on this board in 50 years. So for me, the number one thing that I think I would like to see, and I'm going to continue to push on this throughout this campaign, is the county commissioners get to draw their own districts. And that to me is of great concern, especially when we just went through this fantastic process at the state level. And keep in mind, there were plenty of concerns during that process, right? As there would be, right? Anytime any party has to vie for its own constituency, there's going to be some some concern, some frustration, and that sort of thing. But what concerns me greatly is that there's going to be a redistricting of the county board, and they're going to do it themselves. And of course, without the sort of transparency or oversight of the sort of situation that we had at the legislative level, right, at the state legislature. I would like to see more transparency in that process. So for me, I'm going to be really focused on that issue as we go into the general election. Whichever Republican I end up going up against, out of this primary, right? Because I'm unopposed. So whoever ends up coming out of the Republican primary, I'm hoping that we'll be able to have some really good conversations about transparency in the county board and making sure that those districts end up being representative of the population here and not cutting it up in such a way that they get to maintain a 5 Republican majority for another series of terms.
COVID, how do you think the commissioners and the board of public health, El Paso County Public Health and the county commissioners, how would you rate their collaboration and the response to the COVID pandemic? And what would you do differently, if anything?
So I don't know. So I think that the county health department was doing a lot of really good work when it came to COVID-19. It concerns me that there was as much language that was being used that was kind of counterintuitive, sort of this kind of battle of political will versus using the facts and data to guide decision making. So for me, again, this is one of those things where I think the difference between what I think the average citizen in this county probably was thinking about when it came to COVID-19 versus the political response to what COVID-19 really should be, like how we should tackle COVID-19. There was just such a wide gulf. And to me, that is, again, when you have such an echo chamber within a board, right? When you have a one group that is kind of managing all of the communication, all of that, discussion, when that becomes the only elevated voice, then you have that sort of disconnect between what the average person really really cares about what they're willing to do in order to solve the problems. To me, that was concerning. But in terms of what I would say that I would do differently, I think that the biggest thing would be to encourage the sort of participation in solution finding and actually enacting the things that we need to do in order to keep our community safe, right? So likely, let's say I get elected, I'm still only going to be 20% of the board, right? There's no sudden like shift that the Democrats are now in control, right? But at least maybe there's some opportunity for people to look at the board and say, okay, there are people that agree with me, and maybe I can help to push the board in some direction towards more reasonable kind of language around how we deal with a global pandemic that ends up showing up in our county.
Affordable housing, any opinions on affordable housing in the county and what the board might be able to do to address that?
Yeah, so I think obviously the relationship between these communities, as we were talking about before, right? I mean, we need to make sure that there's not downstream consequences. I mean that literally and figuratively, right? Downstream consequences between new development and the communities that have existed there for decades, sometimes centuries, right? Century. I think it's important if we're going to continue to grow in this county, right, in Colorado Springs and around the county, I think we have to make sure that those developers are responsible to the plans that we have in place already in this county, right? So that means that we have to make sure that they're adhering to the 300-year water plan, right? That they're making sure that they're going to be responsible for fire maintenance long term, right? All of these things, as we continue to build in additional density across the county, we have a responsibility to the entire community to make sure that everyone is going to stay safe and healthy and happy, right? So in order for us to do that, we have to make sure that developers are held to account as they continue to build in the way that we need it. We need that building to occur in this county. And we do need, I mean, we need that, we need these developments, right? We need affordable housing so that way we can bring in talent that can fill the massive amount of jobs that are available here in El Paso County right now that are unfilled, right? We don't have an unemployment problem here. We have a lot of jobs here that are unfilled. In order for us to fill those jobs and to continue to build these communities so that way critical services can be provided, we have to make sure that there's enough workforce to actually support those communities. And part of that comes down to making sure that we have affordable housing so that those individuals, as everyone realizes the American dream, right? You have to start from someplace and you have to build up, right? And so affordable housing is critical to that process.
What's the board's responsibility and what would you do to address the rising crime problem and especially violent crime?
Yeah. So rising crime obviously is a problem nationwide. Obviously, we're seeing some very significant, I mean, Tulsa just yesterday, right? Uvalde last week, Buffalo the week before that. Those sorts of crimes are those sorts of crimes are absolutely heart-wrenching, and we have got to start to look at crime in a little bit more of a pandemic sort of way. My concern with rising crime is that it typically follows sort of a path of escalation when you don't put in the underlying solutions that are necessary to actually prevent crime. So we're not talking about policing, we're talking about poverty, right? For me, the county has an incredible opportunity by creating the sort of underpinning and intergovernmental roles to help to deal with issues like poverty, like healthcare. These are the things that end up resulting in decreased criminality, not additional policing, not to say that we don't keep our communities safe. We're likely going to have to increase, the number of sheriff's deputies, right? We're going to likely have to increase. Colorado Springs is likely going to have to continue to increase its police department, right? You're going to need some mechanism for ensuring safety and security. But getting to the root cause of the problems is going to pay dividends significantly faster than additional policing will. So for me, that means we need to be investing further in community health. It means we need to be investing further in education. We need to be making education cheaper. We need to be improving access to resources. So again, it comes back to transportation, right? Making sure that people can get to a job and they can do so safely and conveniently, right? Those are the sorts of problems that in order to solve criminality, you have to look at the source, and the source is not inherently criminal behavior. It's an escalating problem of wealth disparity, lack of access to resources, intentional design in communities that end up not resulting in the ability for people to move freely, safely, and again with their health in mind.
You are, well, I guess we don't know who you're running against yet, but why are you more qualified than either of your opponents, whoever it is you're going to face?
So again, if the lens through which that I am running is that I am able to have those conversations, I think I am vastly more qualified than either of the other two candidates. There's no doubt about it. Holly's already been in this position for a term, so she's got more qualifications than I do to be on the board from an experience perspective, specifically to this job, right? But what is true, I think, is that if we're going to continue to develop, if the county's going to continue to grow, if there are going to eventually be this there's going to be this gap between the number of people who don't agree with the county as the population shifts. There's going to need to be somebody who is representative on this board. And again, this goes back to the point earlier about I'm not running against whoever the Republican is in CC1, right? This is about a much larger problem, which is the county board being able to write its own districts and pick its own constituents and end up resulting with another 5 Republican board. So I have nothing against Holly Williams specifically. I've met Holly. I like Holly as a person. I don't agree with all of her views on things, but I don't dislike Holly in any way, and I would never say anything like I am more qualified to be in this position than Holly. But I think everybody in the Republican Party should have no illusions that they are the party in charge here, and they should not run unchallenged. The number of unaffiliated voters here outnumbers the Republicans. So why are the unaffiliateds not given the voice that they need? Why are the 25% of Democrats in El Paso County, why do they have no voice on a 5-member board? That to me is the concern. And I will continue to fight for the ability to have representation on that board without having this sort of kind of closed Republican shield on that board.
Ryan, tell us about a mistake you've made and what you did to rectify it.
mistake I've made and what I've done to rectify it. Boy, this is like a job interview question.
It is a job interview.
It is a bit of a job interview, isn't it? Let's see, a mistake I've made and what I've done to rectify. That would have been a good one to give to me ahead of time,
Yeah.
so I could come up with like a good answer to it.
Do you want to, I have one more like that. You could answer maybe that one first and think about the mistake one. What kind of leader are you?
See, this one, I can totally do this one, and then
Okay.
we'll see if we can come back to the other one.
Yeah, sure.
I've held a lot of different leadership positions in my life. So first of all, let me just back up really quickly. So I was an Eagle Scout. I was a Boy Scout, as a kid. Leadership was drilled into me like from an early age, right? It was, leadership is kind of one of the key aspects of Boy Scouts that, they really kind of make sure is important. Oh, great. And this actually leads me to my greatest mistake. Okay, I've got it. Okay.
All
I'm
right.
going to tie these two answers together if that's all right.
Perfect.
Can I answer both of them with one answer? Okay.
I think so.
Okay. So what I consider in terms of my leadership style, and I think what is a governing property of the way that I do things in my life, is that I want to be the person that lifts up the person that does not have within themselves the capacity to solve the problem on their own, right? I'm the person who brings to bear the resources.
Mhm.
So a really great example of where this so my brother who's in the Air Force, he's stationed overseas, and actually as soon as we get off this call, I'm jumping on a plane to go see him in Phoenix because he's here for like 2 weeks, and then he goes off to South Korea. So so my brother ran into a problem, and he had sent me a message and said, "Hey man, I've run into this problem. I don't know what I'm going to do. My family's getting broken apart." Right. So his wife and kids came back to the States because he's getting sent over to South Korea. He was expecting he was going to be able to come back stateside and start training. So he's a mechanic, plane mechanic. So he thought he was going to be able to come back and start training new mechanics. And instead he's getting sent for another deployment now in South Korea. And so I immediately went into like, okay, let's find some solutions for this problem. So I started like, reaching out to my representative. I started doing research on additional representatives that were in districts that I could potentially ping people and say, hey, you need to write to your representative about this. Of course, I wrote to Doug Lamborn and got no response from him. But so I started to go directly into solution finding, right? And that's kind of the way that I do a lot of things in my life is I want to kind of lift up people when they have a problem and they don't know how to solve that problem, right? I want to bring those resources to bear and go into kind of solution finding mode, which brings us to a great mistake, right? So when I was in Boy Scouts, so I was I was in Boy Scouts. I was very, very active until I was about 16. When I was 16, I got a job. I started working at a Wendy's. So I was working mostly in the drive-through. I was like the drive-through person, like the person in the window, because I was really good at counting change back. Because back then everybody paid with cash. That's how old I am. So I was working at Wendy's, and so Boy Scouts became very difficult for me to kind of make it to those meetings because I was always scheduled during meetings and camping trips. It was very difficult for me to do that stuff. And I came from a very poor. My mom would hate if I said a very poor family. We were not the wealthiest of families in Arkansas. So me having a job was a really great way for me to actually have some money. So my job became very important to me. But when I was about 17 and a half years old, so about a year and a half, I was not very active in the Boy Scouts, but I was about 17 and a half years old. And I realized that I only had about 6 months left, and I had been a Life Scout since I had been like 14 years old. Life is just the rank just below Eagle. So I had been a Life Scout forever, and I realized that I had not actually achieved Eagle Scout, and that was something that had been important to me when I was younger. And it was something that I could always point to, or that I was hoping that I could always point to, that my father never became an Eagle Scout, but I was going to become an Eagle Scout. And then I let that dream fall away from me because, my job became so important. So with something like 5 months left before I would no longer be qualified to become an Eagle Scout, because once you hit 18, you can no longer become an Eagle Scout. I rededicated myself to fixing that problem. And so I immediately said, okay, so I need to come up with a plan, because the only thing that I'm really missing is what's called an Eagle Scout project, which is a big community service project you have to do. So I immediately drew up this plan. I was like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up a 5K. And then we're going to take all the funds raised from that 5K, and we're going to donate it to a community there's a high school organization that fought teenage smoking. So I was like, this is a great, I've got a plan, right? So I came up with a plan, I executed on the plan, and I did it within 2 months or something like that. And then I turned in my Eagle Scout project to the Eagle Scout Review Board, and they rejected it. And they said, you didn't have anybody else involved in this project. You did it yourself. And that's not the purpose of an Eagle Scout project. And that was crushing. That was absolutely crushing. So here I was, I had made the mistake of not getting the work done when it should have been done, right? I let that kind of lapse. And then when I went to go solve the problem, I just ran and did it on my own instead of bringing in people to help me. So I wasn't certain what I was going to do at that point, but I ended up getting a really great recommendation about a camp that was about 45 minutes away from where I lived, that had some major work that needed to be done around the camp. And I got together a huge group of volunteers. I think there were 40 of us that ended up going on this trip. We blazed a trail that was I want to say it was something like 150 feet long. We built a fire pit out in this little area that was out away from things. I ended up nearly being hospitalized during that project because I actually fell between a truck and a trailer. I still have scars up and down my back and along the fronts of my legs from when all of that occurred.
Yikes.
But we got this massive group of people together, and we were able to execute on this over a weekend. I turned in my new Eagle Scout project, and the Eagle Review Board said, this is exactly what we want to see. This is the sort of project that we want to see. You got a group of people together, you led them through the plan, they executed on the plan, and the results were exactly what you were expecting. You knocked it out of the park. So so coming back to the question about what type of leader are you, one thing that is true is that I will charge off into the battlefield, knowing that there are things that are sometimes not going to go well, but ultimately the people that I surround myself on that battlefield, the people that I am there to fight for, I'm going to give them every single possible ounce of any possible connection, resource, solution that I could potentially help to bring to bear. So I think it's a version of servant leadership, like if you want to put like a term on it, but I think it goes beyond that. It really does come down to recognizing when somebody has an idea that they want to accomplish something and helping them achieve that goal. That's the sort of leader that I always strive to be, and kind of the underpinning of the way that I approach things.
Okay. Glenn, did you want to introduce yourself, and did you have any questions?
Hi, sorry I was late.
Hi,
Glenn
Glenn.
Wallace, editor for the Southeast Express. I just want to be selfish and ask specifically for the parts of the city that are maybe more underdeveloped or kind of perhaps languished from the attention of the current county commissioners. Where do you see those areas, and what are the opportunities there?
So I'll be completely frank with you. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily as well versed in, Southeast, El Paso County and the particular problems that impact that community. I think that's one of those things that I would definitely, I'll definitely take a look into, and I can get back to you on that, Glenn. I will say that I think that there are a lot of communities that have languished, and I think that there's again some focus on making some decisions that provide a sort of tiered approach to development that I think is going to be important for the entire county. And so being a part of that board, and again, it's a 5-member board with districts, but they're not independent districts. It's not like all of this stuff just exists in its own vacuum, right? So the board has to operate with all of those districts in mind. So what I would say is that likely those are the sorts of things that when we're considering development across the entire county, we have to look at those services as if they are countywide and not district based.
Anything else, Glenn?
No,
Okay.
good.
Amy, did you have anything? Nothing from Amy. Okay. So Ryan, these videos are going up sort of as we speak. We're doing some fact checks, and then they're hitting the web, and our print endorsements are going to come out on June 15th. So be on the lookout for that issue of the Indy. And
You're already doing general endorsements? Or those
no,
are
sorry,
primary
these,
endorsements?
yeah, for the primary.
Okay.
So,
The
yeah.
primary.
So you'll
Gotcha.
see who we endorse, I guess, for your opponent. But
Yes.
yeah, so we appreciate your time, and best of luck to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.